Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Thanks for joining us for Behavior Analyst Talks About Aging. And over the next 100 minutes, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs with Charlie Catania. So thank you so much, Charlie, for doing this with us. And so as I said, during the next 100 minutes, you're gonna have the chance to earn 2 CEUs, and the way that you'll earn those CEUs is by staying the entire time of the webinar. So if you miss 5-10 minutes, or a colleague is gonna miss 5-10 minutes, then they will not qualify for those CEUs. And also by answering poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So I hope that you've joined with that join webinar button that was emailed to you. Should you be having any technical difficulties and you had to dial in audio only, just please also make sure that you do join that alternate route, just because GoToWebinar cannot record your attendance if you are dialed in audio only. Alrighty, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and put them in the questions box. It's that little chat box with the question mark inside of it. And if you didn't have a chance already, go ahead and download the handouts under the little paper clip with the piece of paper icon there. And if you have any questions, please let me know. But all right, I'll go into more details about CEUs and polls when the first poll comes up. But for now, here's Charlie.
Okay, well, greetings, everybody. So, as you can see, the title for today, a behavior analyst talks about aging. I think I'm kind of qualified for doing that. I've been around for a few years, uh, and we've been covering a variety of different topics. Some of them have been about contentious issues. There are issues with respect to gender and issues with respect to race and issues with respect to all sorts of things. Age is sometimes one of them. And for that reason, I've decided with this one, along with some of the others that I've done, I ought to put in a trigger warning, especially for older folks in the audience, in case you may find a couple of stories that I tell a little bit bothersome. Ageism is out there too. Some of the general background in which from which I've been drawing things for these kinds of talks are presented in my book, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. I'm showing this to you in part because I want you to know that if you're interested in the book, if you use the link here for BDS that's shown at the bottom of this slide, you can get a discount and free shipping if you're interested. But let me move on. Essentially, the outline for this talk, when when you would have seen it on the BDS site, is as follows, and I might as well just run through it just because this is the organization for what we're going to be talking about, although the orders change around a little bit. Our behavior changes with age, and though we have ample opportunities to see the various ways in which it can develop in those around us, and I can speak personally about it, we nevertheless may find ourselves unprepared when we discover that such changes are manifesting themselves in our own behavior. So what we're going to do today, we're going to consider some ways in which behavior analysts have addressed issues of aging, and particularly we're going to mention Skinner and Vaughan's book called Enjoy Old Age. That'll actually come up later, not earlier. We're going to examine some of the behavioral effects of changes in sensory processes like vision and hearing and of remembering. We'll discuss a little bit the ways to manage these kinds of effects, and we'll review some examples of ageism, especially as we see them in contemporary culture. Something that we behavior analysts should know about and should be prepared to address when it comes up. So here's an overall outline. I will essentially break this down into 4 parts. I'm going to spend a little time talking about changes in vision with age, a little time talking about changes in hearing with age, a little time talking about changes in remembering and forgetting. Notice there in those topics, I've got the verbs remembering and forgetting, not memory and not loss of memory, not talking about things, but talking about what we do. And then the last topic, aging and ageism in general. Just for the record, how should we spell it? Sometimes you'll see it without the E, and sometimes you'll see it with the E. I've shown them both here. I prefer the latter because for me, the version without the E can be something that is hard to get your tongue around sometimes, or when you read it, you can tend to almost read it and mispronounce it. Uh, but for those of you who care about those kinds of things, I've checked a few dictionaries. The ones I've checked show both being acceptable, with a slight favoring, I think, in contemporary American culture for the former rather than the latter, but I really do prefer the latter. So, given all of that, let's start right out and give Marissa a chance to show you how the poll questions work. Here's the first poll question for you.
Alrighty, everybody. So, a box should have appeared up on your screen, and you should be able to select an answer with regard to the spelling of aging. Now, please choose an answer on which one's correct. With the E is only correct. Without the E is only correct. Both are correct, or neither. Now, if you, for whatever reason, are having trouble seeing the poll question, I will be reading the question and the answers as I just did for each poll. Please have a piece of paper with either a Word document or an email open so you can record your poll answers if you have trouble. These are a requirement if you need CEUs. So if you have technical difficulties, you still need to participate from one of those alternative um, options that I gave you. But please, please, please make sure that you are participating if you need CEUs. If you only need a general certificate of attendance, that will come just about an hour after we end here today. It's completely free of charge, and you don't necessarily need to participate in these poll questions if you don't want to, but they're kind of fun and kind of quizzy. Um, let's share these results now. And it looks like 3% say with the E is only correct, 20% say without the E is only correct, 77% say both, and nobody says neither.
And the majority was right. Both of them are okay according to the dictionaries, but I did express my preference to the one for the one with the E. Okay, now let's move on to the topics. And what I'm going to do is start with century changes, vision. Now, I have here on my desk a copy of this book, although it looks like I've got the mirror image reflection. So I don't have control of the orientation there. But this is Enjoy Old Age spelled backwards. And this is the Skinner book that he wrote with his younger colleague Maggie Vaughan a long while back. Um, Actually, it's been a while since I read it. I was probably too young to appreciate it when I first read it, and I've been catching up now. And I actually had put together the organization of this talk, including the sensory processes coming up first. And it turns out that if you look at his table of contents, or their table of contents, um, uh, the chapter titles are themselves sort of revealing thinking about old age, doing something about old age. And then chapter 3 is keeping in touch with the world. And keeping in touch with the world is a chapter about the sensory changes with aging. So, in fact, inadvertently, I ended up duplicating a little bit about of the organization in the Skinner Vaughan book, in the organization of what I'm presenting here to you today. Um, he also has a chapter immediately after the ones on sensory stuff on keeping in touch with the past, on remembering. And there again, it's a verb, remembering, not the noun memory. And then things like thinking clearly, keeping busy, having a good day, getting along with people, feeling better, unnecessary end, the fear of death, playing the old person. Um, and it's a neat little book. It is a useful book, and in fact, I think many of the suggestions in it apply to people of any age. Uh, One of the little anecdotes about it, by the way, is that when the book was finally published, it came out with nice big print on the pages. Um, Apparently, even though the audience was supposed to be older folks, apparently they had trouble when they published this book getting the publisher to publish it with big print. And Skinner thought that one of the things you should have if it's a book for that especially is addressing issues that older folks might want to read about. Make it easier for them to see the pages and make the print real big. He finally did manage to get that done, and that's the way the book came out. I'll start with a little bit of a story. And this happened a while ago, but I think I was old enough at that point um, to be included in the appropriate population for today's talk. Um, my wife and I were visiting her mother at a retirement home, and I was carrying a fairly heavy satchel of stuff on my shoulder. And just as we entered her apartment, I pulled it off and dropped it to the floor, and I must have jarred myself in doing that because in walking into the room, I suddenly saw blood running up the far walls. Strange kind of sight to see. I covered up my uh, left eye, and I still saw the blood running up the far walls. I covered up my right eye, and I couldn't see the blood anymore, so it was pretty easy to see whatever was happening inside my right eye. Um, I then deduced that since I saw the blood going up the far walls and it was a projection on my retina, casting a shadow essentially, that the blood must have been denser than the optic fluids in the eyeball. Anyway, it turns out that if you have something like that happen, it's not a bad idea to see an ophthalmologist to make sure it's not something serious. Um, And in fact, since it was a little bit of a drive, this is the winter time, I spoke to an ophthalmologist on the phone and they set up an appointment for me. They figured that they could see me, given the timing, if I went to an emergency room, I'd probably wait as long as it would have taken us to drive home anyway. On the way, it was a snowy day and there was lots of bright areas to look at. The snow had just fallen, and it was sunny at this time. The snow itself had stopped, but what I saw was dust storms. And I found that if I covered my left eye, I saw the dust storms, and if I covered my right eye, I didn't. And my deduction was that the what seemed to be particles of dust that were moving around were actually shadows of the blood corpuscles from the internal bleeding in my eye. And then a little bit later, over the next couple of days, if I was looking at someone who was against a light background, maybe a light background like what's behind me right now, it turned out that they had halos. Now, if I had been born in an earlier century, I might have thought that somebody was sending me a message. Blood on the walls, dust storms, halos, all of these kinds of things. But it turns out that once I got talking to the ophthalmologist, all of this made sense. It requires a particular combination of things all happening at once. And he said that he expected he'd see something like this by chance, maybe once every 25 years or so. It turned why did I see it? So to do that, let's talk a little about the eyeball. Um, the eyeball, the the in this instance, the eye is looking toward the left, and the light comes in, passes through the cornea and the lens, goes through the vitreous gel, and eventually hits the retina, which is at the back end of the eyeball. Now, the vitreous gel is sort of like Jello. But it has a certain consistency to it. And what I later learned was that as we get older, this stuff gets a little bit denser, and occasionally a little bit of it can adhere to the back of the eyeball. It could adhere to the retina. And therefore, a sharp movement or something, if there's an adhesion like that, might be enough to just pull on the retina and cause a little bit of bleeding at that spot. And that's apparently what happened to me. Uh, there was a little adhesion, but the thing about it that was special was, in my case, it was right near the center of vision, right near what's called the macula, uh, the 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 region central and the in the eye, which is most sensitive and which you see detailing when you're reading. That's the part of the eye that's serving that function pretty much. The light goes there. Now, the curious thing about the retina is that the optic nerves are actually in the back of it. The light, in this case, uh, 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 well, the optic nerves are at the part of the retina that's closest to where the light comes from, but the actual rods and cones, the cells that respond to that light, are actually at the back of the retina. So the light comes and goes through all of these kinds of things before it hits the rods and cones, and then they fire and they send things on through the optic nerve and so forth. What had happened to me was that there's a little space between the vitreous and the retina, and if there's any bleeding, it'll fill in that space. And so, as you see in a little blow up here of this back part of the eye, the fovea or the macula, that sensitive region, is in one place. And what had happened to me was right near the fovea. And in fact, that was more than a decade ago. And I still have some remnants of that in my right eye, which causes little distortions. When I look at things, they are curvy instead of straight. Well, they're straight edges. This is a picture from the ophthalmologist point of view. And so the macula is in the center. The optic nerve is where all of the nerves coming from all over the retina go out the optic nerve. And if you see an ophthalmologist, you'll know they're concerned about the optic nerve because that's one of the places where things show early on. Should you have things like increasing intraocular pressure, that might be the beginnings of glaucoma, other kinds of things that can go wrong. One thing about the optic nerve that's curious is that it has a ring around it, a little bit of tissue, and it's called a Weiss ring. I'm showing it here. You see it here on the left part. It's not a complete ring that you see. And something that agitates the eyeball occasionally, and this is unusual, lets the ring break loose. And as far as my ophthalmologist was able to determine, uh, there was a little tear very close to my fovea, which caused the bleeding, and the blood ran down my eyeball. And because you're seeing everything reversed, because light from below goes to the upper part of the eyeball, light from above goes to the lower part, from the left goes to the right, and so forth. So I was seeing that bleeding, and then I was seeing the shadows of the cells. But apparently, the same thing that produced that little adhesion and the tear, the bleeding, also released the Weiss ring, which for perhaps uh, geometric reasons, but the three-dimensional geometry, it seemed to have settled right around the fovea, and that's why I saw people in halos, because it created a little shadow. And if I was looking at a person against a white background and saw that shadow, that person had a halo. So, what does this example tell us about our eyes? They change over time. The more we know about vision, the better we're able to handle things like this. Because I had, when I was a graduate student, uh, taken a degree in experimental psychology, not in behavioral analysis in those days. I had had a lot of coursework in vision and I actually did a little bit of research in vision. So when these things started to happen, I was able to interpret them. Um, so what are our eyes doing as we age? They need to be calibrated. You go in every once in a while, you have them, they have you read the eye chart and they'll change your glasses. They need preventive maintenance. Um, and if something happens, you need to attend to them properly and promptly in case repair is necessary. And that's what happened in this case. One additional kind of repair, and this is one that many of you may have to address, some of you are probably way too young to worry about it yet, involves the lens. This is again another picture of the eye with light coming in from the left side. It goes through the cornea and through the pupil and through the lens and eventually reaches the retina at the back of the eyeball. Um, the lens over time is affected by the light that passes through it, some of which is uh, uh, ultraviolet, not just the standard light colors that we see. And as you get older, it begins to turn color a little bit. It begins to turn yellow. So let's talk a little bit about one of the things that the ophthalmologists do about that is they do cataract surgery. They take out the old lens, which is turning yellow, and they replace it with a clearer lens. If it's turning yellow, what it does is it blocks the blue light. If it blocks the blue light, then you're going to have trouble seeing things like, especially navy blue, where it might be a relatively sophisticated discrimination you have to make in the first place. Now, this is different from color blindness, and we'll talk a little bit about that before I move on to other topics. Um, but color blindness itself is a fascinating phenomenon because not everybody sees the whole spectrum in color. And when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, there was uh, somebody in the psychology department who was studying color blindness, and he happened to accidentally to have as a subject in some of his research a young woman from Barnard College, which was across the street. Columbia back in those days was all male, wasn't co-ed. She happened to be colorblind in only one eye. And therefore, what you could do with her was to have her look at the colors with the eye that had standard color vision, the kind that most of the rest of the population has, and then look at it with the other eye, which was a colorblind eye, and was able to describe what things look like, but you know that she learned the language with the eye that was able to see the full spectrum of color. And indeed, she said that with the eye with color vision covered up, things looked like a black and white movie. With the other eye, she could name all the colors and all of that. It's unusual not only because of color blindness in just one eye but not the other, but also because color blindness is much rarer in women than in men. Men tend to be colorblind. My father-in-law was colorblind, wouldn't acknowledge it. Um, my mother was colorblind, and she used to wear the weirdest outfits. And that led to a problem early on when my wife used to think I was colorblind, and then we finally realized that I learned all the color names from my mother. So instead of learning purple, brown, violet, and those kinds of things, those words were a kind of a jumble. Uh, but on the other hand, if I did the tests with things you looked at, I was able to pass those tests. Well, anyway, we'll come back to that just briefly. We're most of the way through this topic, but this gives you an idea of what's happening to the lens as you age. The lens is pretty clear when you're 6 months old. Once you become 8 or 12, it's getting a little bit of an effect, but it takes a lot of years. When you're getting into your 80s, it's especially if you spend a lot of time outdoors, it's getting more and more orange and it's blocking the blue light. Now, I eventually did have my cataracts done, and when they do that, they will do one eye, and then you come back a couple of weeks later and do the other one. They'll usually do the worst eye first and then fix that and make sure that you got good vision there before they. It's one of the safer operations you can have these days. So when I had the first eye done, went outdoors and looked up and covered up the eye that had been just had the surgery done and was looking at the sky with the one that still had the yellowish lens, and it was a smoggy day. But then I switched to the other eye, and suddenly I was seeing a beautiful blue sky. All the blues suddenly popped. It was easy once again to see navy blue. And so that wasn't the color blindness issue either. Now, I mention this here because one of the things that's going to happen as all of you folks get older is these changes will occur. The more you know about them, the better prepared you will be to address them. And let me assure you, what you can see has an effect on your behavior. And so these are kinds of things that people should address. In fact, um, historically, psychophysics, the study of sensory systems, the courses in sensation and perception, have always been areas of research that were single organism kinds of studies. You don't want to know about the average eye. You want to know about the eye of this particular person. You want to know what that person's visual thresholds are. You want to know what color that person can see. If you're working with children, you want to know whether they've got visual problems, because if a child's having difficulty reading and you want to come up with something having to do with alexia and other kinds of dyslexia problems having to do with reading, um, the first thing you really ought to find out is whether this child has a correctable problem with vision. Um, every behavior analyst ought to have as part of their repertory an understanding of the sensory systems. And in fact, one of the things, if any of you are ever in a position to say something about the required courses in behavior analysis curricula, I urge you to try to get sensory psychology included in the requirements for every every BCBA person, because you're dealing with individuals where some problems can arise simply because of sensory problems, sensory issues. So you got to know something about them. Just to give you an idea with respect to color vision, uh, I don't know whether you can see it. And by the way, don't take these too seriously because we don't know anything about the color balances in the computer monitor or the handheld device that you may be looking at this. But many of you probably can see that there's a square and a circle there. If you can't, the next time you get an eye exam, you might want to ask your ophthalmologist to tell you whether you're colorblind or not. It's possible to be colorblind and really not even notice it, especially if it's only a partial thing where it's only out at some a small portion of the spectrum. Here's one that again has a square and a circle. Notice the differences. If you were colorblind, to so that you weren't seeing the differences between yellows and these kind of greenish sorts of things, you would not be able to see this square. And here's one that has a picture of something there. Um, for those of you who don't see it, you should be seeing a picture of a sailboat. And other kinds of things. You can have the detachment of the retina. The retina can tear, and if it tears then and folds up, then the light's hitting it, but it's in the wrong place. It may be even folded over. This is a serious kind of thing. Floaters are little things that you may see in the visual field. If you get big changes of that sort, um, go see an ophthalmologist. And by the way, please, a caveat: I'm talking here not as a person in medicine, but as a behavior analyst who's had some history with respect to these are the kinds of things that you ought to get medical opinions or on. Don't try to uh, uh, do your own diagnoses. Glaucoma, for example, is something that doesn't have any obvious correlate. It doesn't hurt or anything like that, but it is a buildup of pressure within the eyeball. That buildup of pressure can eventually damage the optic nerve. The optic nerve gets sufficiently damaged, and you're going to lose vision. So it is really important, especially as you get older, to go and have a glaucoma test every once in a while. Macular degeneration is a problem in the deterioration of the cells in the retina. Visual migraine is a central kind of thing where you see flashes of light um, that come unexpectedly. I have that from time to time, and the first time you see them, they kind of worrisome and surprising. Typically, they last for just a few minutes and fade away. Cataracts, a very standard kind of thing that happens. All of these kinds of things you can expect you become more likely to encounter with age. So keep a lookout for them. And now let's ask you a question about it. Here's a poll question on the visual stuff.
Alrighty, everybody. If you've had trouble seeing navy blue lately, get checked for stigmatism, cataracts, glaucoma, or macular degeneration.
I have the suspicion that folks are going to do pretty well on this.
Alrighty, everybody. Thanks for voting. We're just waiting for the last couple of votes to get in. That number's not quite as high as it has been the previous poll. Alrighty. Thank you so much. Let's close this out. It looks like 3% say astigmatism, 74% say cataracts, 10% say glaucoma,
Hooray.
and
Yep.
13% say macular degeneration.
Oh, and if some of you are due for cataract surgery or something like that, do the experiment of looking during the time between having one eye done and having the other eye done. It's really very informative and very surprising to see the changes in color. I hadn't even been aware of this until I had my first cataract operation done, and it's really I suppose it's not as dramatic as the eclipse that we're going to have coming up fairly soon. If you're somebody who lives within the range of totality there, by the way, be sure to wear the protective glasses. Just another thing about vision that we might as well mention. But it's time for us to move on. Let's talk a bit about hearing for a while. Hearing actually can be more of an issue with respect to older folks than seeing sometimes. Um, and there's some things that involve some social contingencies on top of the sensory things. Well, the ear is a pretty complicated organ. Um, this of course shows the pin of the outside portion of the ear, and the sound comes in. Again, it's coming from the left. For some reason, people who draw this stuff have the stimulus origin off on the left side. It comes through and it finally reaches the eardrum, and when it does, it makes it vibrate, and that moves the bones in there. There are these bones that link to the round window, which connects to an organ called the uh, the cochlea, and it's kind of like a snail shell space, but inside the cochlea there's this membrane, and when sound occurs, then this membrane begins to shake. And connected to this membrane are two kinds of cells here. They're called the hair cells, and they tend to start becoming functional at different levels. So that just as in vision, you have rods and cones, the cones are very sensitive to low levels of light to stimulate um, I'm sorry, the rods are sensitive to very low levels of light. To stimulate the cones, you have to have a brighter level of light. And it turns out that there are things about vision that change as a function of how dark it is there and the colors that you can see. And that's because there are these two systems of rods and cones in the eyes. Well, similarly, the inner and outer hair cells in the ear also divvy up function like that. And it's actually not until you get to the point where, and I right now, uh, I'm hesitating a little bit about whether it's the inner or the outer hair cells that are the ones that need the higher intensity of sound. But in any case, there's one set of cells that are activated even by very quiet stuff, and then the others kick in later, and they kick in at a level which is at the point in which you're dealing with human speech. And that's why it's so important to us, because so many of the things that we're involved in, especially if we're dealing with older folks and we're trying to interact with them, are concerned with talking to them and about their speech. Now, um, so this is a little bit more detailed look at the cross section inside the cochlea, and it shows the various cells and the membranes. It's a complicated system. Um, a lot of it was studied by a Nobel Prize winner originally from Hungary, but who was at Harvard in the 50s. He was an associate research professor, and Harvard was reluctant to promote him. And then he got the Nobel Prize. And then Harvard offered him a promotion, and instead he picked up and he moved to the University of Hawaii. Well, you know. But anyway, now what's going on with this? Well, okay, you tend to lose some of your hearing as you get older, and in fact, it's a kind of a different sort of thing. You tend not to see that happening so much with respect to vision, unless you have things like macular degeneration. But you get lots and lots of folks who are hard of hearing. That's the word we. That's the expression we use. We also get more and more young folks these days who have substantial hearing loss at the high frequencies. And that's from things like going to and sitting too close to the speakers at a rock concert or something of that sort. I've had a couple of students who actually had really severe high frequency hearing loss, and attributed it to going to rock concerts in their younger days. Um, and by the way, uh, my background in hearing is one of the things that got me on this thing about talking about uh, making sensory stuff a requirement for people who are going to get degrees in behavior analysis. I was at one of these receptions in the evening at an ABBA meeting. I can't pronounce it ABBI like some folks do for the ABAI. Um, and it was one of these things with where there was uh, uh, a DJ up and there was music going and there were speakers up front and a lot of the graduate students and the younger folks were dancing around there. And I spotted this young woman who had an infant in her arms. I would guess 4 or 5 months old. And she was dancing with this child in their arms and went around right next to the speakers and then came around again. Um, and I was at the periphery there near the entrance, and I just couldn't resist it. And the second time around, I stopped her and I said, you're going right by those speakers, and this child's ears are much more vulnerable to those loud sounds than older folks. And she just stopped and looked at me and she said, "None of your business." And she went for another route. And that really troubled me. There wasn't much else I could do. I wasn't about to uh, call the police for child abuse or something like that because I don't probably nothing would have effective would have happened anyway. But it's what got me on started on these things of thinking about, well, gee, maybe if this was a behavior analysis student, for all I know, it was just a friend of a behavior analysis student who happened to be there. I don't know because I had no further conversation. Uh, but it's the sort of thing that behavior analysts ought to know about and ought to be able to give advice about, and to protect the ears of all the little kids that you may end up working with as well. Now, one phenomenon that's really worth knowing about, and by the way, if you ever go and see an audiologist to get your hearing checked, they will be really surprised if you know about this because they know about the phenomenon of recruitment, but most people don't. Ever have this occasion of having an older person in the family and you're off on the other side of the room and you say something to them, they don't answer, so you say it a little louder and they still don't answer, and you say it louder still, and suddenly the person turns around and says, "Don't shout at me." Well, I mean, I actually had this happen with my mother-in-law. Um, and I realized that what I was doing was I was talking to her from the side and she didn't even see that I was talking. And I suddenly realized, well, yeah, this is the phenomenon of recruitment being demonstrated. By the way, my mother was a talker. It was hard to get a word in edgewise. And when both my mother and my wife's mother came at the same time, my mother would talk away and my wife's mother would sit there and knit, and they got along beautifully together. Um, but anyway, let me illustrate what the phenomenon of recruitment is like. For most of us, uh, this scale, by the way, is a ratio scale. It's decibels. You probably know a little about decibels. It's actually a fact. A change of 10 decibels is a real increase in the energy in the signal, and and when you get above 100 decibels, you're getting close to the pain threshold where the sound will be loud enough to actually hurt. Now, for most of us, as the intensity of the sound increases, we will say it's louder and we can assign it numbers. And if we do that, we'll find that there's a pretty neat function relating the one to other. It turns out not to be exactly a straight, a linear kind of thing. It's a power function, but no matter. When you have recruitment, it means probably that one of those kinds of hair cells have become unfunctional. So they're not coming in and producing an effect. They're not producing signals that are going down uh, the acoustic nerve. But what happens is When you get to the point at which the other cells start kicking in, the loudness goes up so that once you start hearing the sound, you're hearing it at essentially the same level you would have heard it um, without this kind of hearing loss. So if you've got this kind of hearing loss, somebody says it softly, they don't hear you. Somebody says it a little bit louder, they don't hear you. They finally get it louder still, and now it sounds as loud as it would have sounded, except now you're shouting. But they didn't hear what got you there, and therefore they're bothered. Don't shout at me. Okay. This again, especially if you're going to be dealing with older folks, if any of you are involved with behavioral geriatrics, the simple thing to do is don't talk to older folks when you're not in their line of sight. Because even if you start loud, it's going to sound pretty loud to them. The thing to do is to always make sure you're standing in front and facing them so they can see you talking. This, of course, has been complicated since we've had COVID and all, because people wearing masks, you can't see their mouth moving, but you usually can tell, at least with a mask, if you're looking at them, that somebody is talking to you. So this is another one of those features that, to me, are an important dimension of understanding about behavior that's involved with changes in our sensory capacities. When we get older, we are becoming changed organisms. Things that we used to be able to discriminate um, among, we no longer can do very well. And to the extent that we fail to do that, we run into problems. And sometimes it's as simple a thing as that. Now, for some reason or other, hearing aids seem to be a thing that's stigmatized. Nobody seems to be bothered about wearing glasses. But if you're wearing hearing aids, people want to hide it. They don't want it to show. I don't know exactly why that should be. We are perfectly willing to accept the fact that people correct their vision with eyeglasses. Why we shouldn't be equally willing to accept the fact that people correct their hearing with hearing aids is not obvious to me. But it's another one of those dimensions of things that uh, are matters of concern when we start worrying about what happens and changes in aging. So we've run through a little bit about hearing. Let's have a question about it. Here's poll question number 3.
Alrighty, everybody, go ahead, take some time to answer this one.
Okay, recruitment and hearing loss is when you A, have auditory hallucinations, B, can't hear stereo sound anymore, start to hear ringing in your ears, or go from not hearing things to being too loud. Which is it, folks? I think I'm going to like this one too.
Alrighty, let's shut this down. And it looks like 3% say have auditory hallucinations, 6% say can't hear stereo sound anymore, 9% say can't start to hear ringing in your ears, and 82% say go from not hearing to things being too loud.
Good. The majority has it. Thank you. Okay, now let's talk a little about remembering. Um, I've given a talk from time to time, which is called, I forgot the name of this talk. But anyway, all right, let me start with the story here. This is especially the one where uh, I talked about trigger warnings and all. Um, because when I used to tell this story, it never occurred to me that this is an ageist story. This is a story, it's an old couple in the living room. And the wife is sitting in the living room. The husband's getting up and he's going to be going out to the kitchen. He says, "Honey, while I'm out there, can I get you anything?" And she says, um, uh, "Sure. Uh, Go and get me some strawberries and bring me back some strawberries and ice cream." And he says, "Sure, no problem." He goes in the kitchen and she says, "Remember, strawberries and ice. Oh, and by the way, I'd like a little whipped cream on top." And he says, "Sure, whipped cream, strawberries, and ice cream, no problem." He's out there banging away. Time goes by, and a little bit later he comes out, and there he's got on a plate, he's got bacon and eggs. And she says, Oh, I'm sorry. I told the story badly. Um, Before he goes out there, he said, she says to him, they've told us we keep forgetting. Write it down, why don't you? Strawberries and ice cream with cream on top. And he says, oh, don't worry. Trust me. And he comes back out and he's got bacon and eggs on the plate. And she says, I told you to write it down. You forgot the toast. Well, I don't know if anybody out there is laughing or not. That is an ageist story, and I used to tell it casually without even thinking about uh, it's having those kinds of characteristics. It's not a bad story, but and it happens, and some of this happens to some of us, and used to happen to us even a long time ago. Were you ever in the middle of a conversation with a person you really knew very well, but whose name you couldn't remember? Have you ever forgotten an email that was there in a crowded inbox and you think about it 3 or 4 days later and realize you're supposed to answer it right away? Have you ever lost track of where you put your car keys or the TV remote or your cell phone or your glasses? Worst thing about not being able to find your glasses and looking around is realizing you were wearing them the whole time. Have you ever had trouble recalling what you had for breakfast, lunch, or dinner yesterday? Ever walk into a room and you wondered what you went in there for? These are the kinds of things that people make ageist jokes about. And they do happen to younger folks too. And there are things you can do about it, but it all has to do with remembering. Um, Remembering much more often involves names rather than common words. It much more involves things where you do certain things over and over again. So you got very similar things that happen in similar environments that start competing with each other. If you're in the kitchen, then you may be making the coffee or putting together a breakfast or taking care of cleaning up the dishes or whatever, and those will happen in the same place and mainly in somewhat different orders. So those are much more likely to interfere with each other, the things that happen in very different kinds of environments. There are all kinds of things we know about that. And knowing the things we know about some of them, there are techniques we can use to improve upon them. So there are different kinds of remembering, and I'm not going to get into a thing on this. We could talk for a long, long time about it. There's episodic remembering. The folks who study this categorize remembering in terms of what it is to remember. There's things about episodes within our own lives, which they call autobiographical or episodic. There's remembering the words, which is called semantic. There's remembering motor skills, like how you ride a bicycle, procedural. There are all the facts you can talk about, like dates and history and so forth. Some kinds of remembering depend on the environment. If you're in a particular set of circumstances, you might have had something happen, and in a different kind of circumstance you might not remember it, but you get back into that same situation, and that's when it comes to you. Even physiological states can matter. A person who has had something happen while having had a bit too much to drink might not remember that when sober, but if the person goes and drinks again later on and gets in a similar state, that's when the person may remember what happened in the earlier thing. We make some distinctions about remembering based on the timing. There's something called iconic, which is very short presentation. Essentially, the stimulus is there for a little bit. There's what we call short term and long term. That distinction mainly depends upon whether we have a chance to really respond to the stimulus. And then there's some others that depend upon the features that are remembered and so forth. It's just a great big thing, and it's surprising that we can do any of this well. Um, in state-dependent remembering, we should worry about the conditions under which we remembered something, because getting back in that situation may help us to remember it. If you went into that room and you didn't remember what you went there for, go back to where you started and start the sequence from the beginning again, and maybe there's a reasonable chance it'll come back to you. Certainly, probably a better chance than if you just stay there and mull over it. Um, so how did the cognitive folks talk about an event leading to our encoding it, and then when the occasion comes to recall the event, we're supposed to decode it. And they say that what we encoded is a representation of the event. So we saw a word, we said it to ourselves. Saying it to ourselves, they would call an encoding. Saying it to ourselves again and then writing it down would be decoding it. Um, and the saying they would call a representation. But we can talk about the same kind of thing without invoking all this coding stuff. An event leads to a response. When it's time to recall it, we repeat the response, and our response was the representation of the stimulus. Um, our response, we don't remember the visual shape on the screen. Actually, we remember what we said about it when we saw that word on the screen. So with those kinds of things, we have some of the tools. What are these slides for, by the way? Yes, you folks have had a chance to download them, but actually for me, they serve a different kind of function. And I regard them as more important for my talk than I regard them as important for anything you're going to do with them later. Some of you may go back and look at them, but they really just contain these phrases and these words and little things. But for me, they're the things that keep me on track in the talk. They're my mnemonic devices. They're things that remind me about what I'm going to talk about next. So um, one of the major points is remembering is actually rebuilding something. It's not like we're reproducing a stimulus. In fact, the cognitive literature has a whole bunch of stuff that confirms this. If you show people words on a screen and then you look at the mistakes they make are not mistakes based on the visual similarity of letters. So a capital F and a capital E have an awful lot in common. Just the bottom stroke on the E is missing and you got an F. But people don't make that kind of mistake. They make a mistake with words that look very different but sound the same. They'll mistake a T for a D or a D for a T. And what that means is they said the word to themselves, and it was the acoustic similarity that resulted in the errors, which means you're not reproducing the stimulus, you're doing something with it, you're responding to it, and your response to it is the thing that can get distorted in various ways. Um, that makes it more plausible that there are these cases in which we remember things that didn't happen. And early memories are particularly vulnerable. We can talk about vividly remembering certain things in our childhood. Um, and I talk about some things that I know about from my childhood, but I've told stories about that often enough that telling the stories has probably had differential consequences that have shaped up the storytelling. And the evidence is that a lot of the stuff that we think we remember isn't so. When I was involved in teaching courses on learning and also talking about memory and forgetting, I came up with an instance in which I started talking about the things that happen in courthouses where you'd have uh, students recruited from an experiment in which they watch a scene in which there's an accident, and it may be just one car bumps into another. But then they have the students come back for a second session in which they're being deposed because they're going to have to testify in a courtroom. And they get questioned by an attorney. And the question in one group of students is, where were you standing when the first car made contact with the other car? And the other was, where were you standing when the first car smashed into the other car? They both had seen the same bit of film, but one was asked when the one made contact and the other was asked smashed into. The ones who had heard it, who had gotten the question when the one car smashed into the other, were more likely when you had the third part of the experiment in which the students were asked what they saw at the scene of the accident. The ones who heard the word, who were questioned with the word smashed in it, were more likely to say they saw broken glass on the ground at the scene. So just asking them questions between what they saw and their eventual later recall was enough to change what they remembered. There were people who, after the Challenger disaster, psychologists who took advantage of that and had students the couple of days after write down where they were when they heard about the Challenger disaster. And then later in the semester, a month or so later, they gave the same question And even though each student had a vivid story about where they were, it turned out that some of these stories had drastically changed from the stories they told right after it had happened. We know enough about verbal shaping to know that if you nod and respond when somebody saying something, you can change what they say. And you find that stories that people tell can get more and more elaborate depending upon their effects on the audience. I put in there the false memories and John Stoll at the top because even though I was already lecturing about these kinds of things in my learning course a while, some years back, um, my wife was reading the New York Times magazine, and there was an article about the Innocence Project and a whole group of people who'd been imprisoned in Bakersfield for child abuse. And it turned out that what had happened was there was a zealous attorney who would take these kids and have them in a room and say, "Oh yeah, you can see mommy and daddy, but you got to answer some questions first." And it turned out that these kids were eventually persuaded to say things that had happened, and it was essentially verbal shaping that created these false memory. And John Stahl turned out was named in this article, and my wife had once been his babysitter. And this was a guy who went to prison for years before he was exonerated and freed. We were actually able to get in touch with the organization, and she was able to make contact with him, and we've been in contact from time to time. Um, One of the kids who ended up testifying said it always bothered him, and still troubled about it, and even has trouble now because he's a little bit worried about changing the diapers on his own child because of the possibility that somebody's going to misinterpret that and he could end up getting in trouble for it. So these things are real, but they're real because of verbal shaping. You can get people sometimes very persuasively arguing that they remember things, and the remembering was created by contingencies. These are important kinds of things for us to know as behavior analysts. Also, with respect to where the forgetting comes from, there's there's two possibilities. One is you've learned something and then you learn something else, and the second thing you learned created problems for you remembering the earlier stuff, and that's called retroactive effect. Or you learned an earlier thing and later you're learning a new thing, and something about the earlier thing keeps on creating problems for the new thing you learned. Well, it turns out that the bulk of research in learning and forgetting with all kinds of materials, nonsense syllables, meaningful text, and all, suggests that practically all of the interference that occurs in forgetting is of the proactive sort. The earliest stuff interferes with the things we learned most recently. And that makes sense of some of the things we know. We've we've heard that you remember kids from child things that you learned as a kid from you remember these childhood events and you remember them very vividly, and yet you don't remember what you had for breakfast yesterday. But there's a lot else going on here. Um, Breakfast, there are only a few kinds of breakfast you have, and so you might have cereal one day and eggs another day, um, and but there are only a few of them, and since there are only a few, they're more likely to interfere with each other. Whereas the childhood events were usually pretty special; they were unique things that. But the dominance of retroactive effects is a really important part of it. Well, what else? Some effects about revenge. As you get older, by the way, always be concerned about anesthesia. The older you get, the some of the more recent kinds of anesthesias that are used are much less of a problem than the earlier ones. But if you ever have to have surgery and you've got to go into anesthesia and you've got a choice between a spinal thing in which you stay awake or general anesthesia in which they put you to sleep, um, go for the one that involves the minimum amount of anesthesia and always ask them to keep it light because the evidence is that the older you get, the more likely that you'll have some side effects affecting your memory of anesthesia. And as I say, it's better than it used to be because there are new kinds of anesthetics that. So, but by the way, if you're, it can be a problem. Don't assume that just because you forget things as you get older, that's got to be that you're beginning to get Alzheimer's. don't be your own diagnostician. If you're worried about that, get the testing. But expect our brains do actually shrink as we get older. You got to hope that what stays is the most important stuff, and the stuff that you're losing um, is is the less thing. And don't worry about maintain calendars, make lists. I could not manage. You should see my calendar. I got several things every day, and some of them are trivial little things. But once I put them in the calendar, I know I don't have to worry about them. And when I fail to put them in the exact calendar, those are the things that I might remember a week later and recover. But there's nothing wrong with being, and that's actually creating stimuli. When we repeat something to ourselves, we're creating the stimulus. Um, but making it visible and making it a little bit more permanent is not a thing to be bothered by. Um, Forget the talk about having a good memory or having a bad one, no matter what your circumstances. Um, Remembering is something we do. And because it's something we do, it can be shaped, and it can be shaped no matter what the history. I used to do demonstrations in class, which were little experiments with mnemonics, in which by the end of the class, students were discovering that they could remember complicated things that they wouldn't have thought they could handle at the beginning of the class. Um, Contingencies matter, and remembering is behavior. So if you see problems of remembering, one of the things you can do is help by when somebody's forgotten something, offering the name. You get social situations in which you've meeting somebody whose name you think you ought to know, and if you're at a meeting, for example, and you know the name is there on the badge, you still feel a little embarrassed, and making it clear that you're looking at the badge to remember who the person is rather than looking in the eye and saying, "Oh, yes, you're so and so." Um, uh, if you have other people you tend to spend time with, have them give a hint and say to the other person, "Oh, please remind us what's your name," before you have to say something. There are all kinds of tricks you can do with respect to the social stuff. And you can go to that book. Skinner's got several of those kinds of recommendations in the Skinner and Maggie Vaughan in that book. So now let's see. This is a good time to test your remembering because we can ask you a question now and see whether you remember something about what the stuff is that we've been talking about. Here's poll question number 4.
Alrighty, everybody. Experimental studies show that ordinary forgetting occurs mostly because of, and take some time to answer it.
Okay. Interference from early things learned or decay from the simple passage of time, interference from the most recent things learned, or just not paying attention. Hmm. Looks like this is a tougher one than some of the early ones, isn't it?
Alrighty, we'll just give it a couple more seconds. Get the last few votes. Alrighty, here we go. Looks like
Oh,
31% are saying interference from early things learned, 19% say decay from the simple passage of time, 38% say interference from recent things learned, and 13% say not paying attention.
and I take some comfort from the fact that the majority answer was interference, but the direction was a little trickier. It's the earlier stuff. It's proactive. The earlier stuff tends to interfere with the most recent stuff is the correct answer there. But it is interference so that the low numbers for the other two, that that part pleases me. So moving on now. I've already talked a little bit here. The book is the cover is right side up. This is probably easily available. I'm trying to recall whether it's in print, and I should have checked before I got started here as to whether it's available through the B.F. Skinner Foundation, which, by the way, has an awful lot of Skinner's work, and some of it is at remarkably modest prices. You can get PDF versions in which you can do searches for verbal behavior and the behavior of organisms and science and human behavior, all kinds of stuff. It's a remarkable resource, um, and I recommend it to you. And It's just the BF Skinner Foundation. You can do a search for it and get right to it, and it's worth your support too because it's keeping Skinner's books in print. Well, okay, so we've been talking about all of these kinds of things. There's an awful lot of stuff in the Skinner and Vaughan book, and I'm going to sort of mention some of those in passing. But when I was relatively new at this stuff, I would occasionally meet Charlie Ferster, who I didn't get to know very well, sadly. Um, but and so I don't. This is not an exact quotation, but it's a thing that he said very early on in some conversation we had, and this is the gist of it. Charlie, we're behavior analysts. If we run into a problem, we fix it by changing the environment. And that is at the core of a lot of the things we do. Um, uh, we had some problems in my home here uh, with respect to my wife's mother who had trouble negotiating the stairs. We did this a long time ago. We thought it was outrageous at the time, but it turns out to have made a huge difference. We put an elevator in. That's a change in the environment, but it allowed all kinds of things. I didn't have to worry about carrying boxes of paper recycling when I used to generate before computers, when you used to generate tons of paper and carry them down the stairs. If I would go on a trip now, the stuff would go up and down the elevator. Much safer to go up and down an elevator than for older folks than to walk down the stairs. Um, and in fact, as things have developed, we probably couldn't be living in this house now if we hadn't done that a while ago. And so, in retrospect, even though it was an investment at the time that seemed a big one, in retrospect, it was a cheap thing to do. That's a biggie. Not everybody's going to go around and do those big things. But there are all kinds of things to worry about. As you get older, you're going to have to worry about stairways and railings in the house. You're going to worry about the problems you have when you move around, where you have the possibility of tripping. You'll learn that grabbers and tongs and other devices that make it easier to pick things up without having to bend down too far are useful. You'll find that it's useful to have grab bars in bathrooms around the shower and other places in the house. And I put in elevators, and of course, there are stair lifts, there are all kinds of things. If you're not dealing with this, maybe you have older relatives who are dealing with these kinds of things. And when you visit them, you ought to keep an eye out for things that are the hazards. There are things that I'm now becoming much more concerned about than I used to be. If you're in the kitchen and you've got gas stove, gas range, then leaving the kitchen and doing something else and forgetting to turn the burner off is always a thing to worry about, especially if there's something in there that could start a fire. If you've got the old fashioned kind of dishwasher that opens a door down this way, so this is the door close to the floor, and you're walking through and you're not paying attention, and you bang your shin against that thing, you can really give yourself a bad bruise. But even worse, if you fall down and you end up landing on that, you're going to mess up the dishwasher, and you may mess up something about one of your limbs. There now are dishwashers that pull out, by the way, and they are much less likely to create this, and they're getting better and better and more reliable. Start looking around, and do you have outlets in such places that if somebody's walking in this space, they could trip and fall? Do you have carpets that are old enough that they're beginning to spread out so that you got wrinkles in them that eventually you could crawl over? Do you have carpets that have an edge where the edge might sometimes fold back a little bit and it'd be something to trip over? Do you have the little bit of dividers where you're going from one kind of flooring to another so you could trip on that? This handrail I show you here is one of the other things that inspired the elevator that I mentioned. I had a day in which I was pretty lazy and I was still wearing a bathrobe with a pretty floppy sleeve. And I was taking a pile of a box full of paper that I was going to take downstairs that was going to go out to the recycling. And as I came around the bend, it turned out that my sleeve went over this and it was actually caught in there. And I was starting to step down. And I realized that if I pulled myself back, I realized that if I'd been going much faster, I might have had the sleeve caught. I might have had a fall. Who knows what might have happened? In fact, Some years ago, I lost a relative who died because he fell and slipped on the way down a flight of stairs. So stairs are dangerous. If you have older folks who are and you know that they have to negotiate stairs, look into ways to make their lives a little bit easier. Make sure visibility is important. And of course, lighting matters. You can put in these light bulbs that'll turn on when it's dark or that will sense movement so that you're not moving around in the dark. You tend to be pretty confident. Oh, sure, I know this house, I know where things are. But moving in around in the dark can be dangerous. There are all sorts of things. Skinner talks about other kinds of things. You can, Skinner and Vaughan, you can certainly look into those kinds of things. But lighting is an important issue, and it does help to have even brighter lighting these days. And it can be much more economical to do this nowadays than you used to. Certainly get LED lights, um, and you can actually, if some of you are still using incandescents, I ask you to look at your bills. It turns out it can make a huge difference in your energy bills if you're using old lighting and you switch to the new low voltage stuff. Well, you can all get your hands on Enjoy Old Age. If you can't get it, there are lots of copies available on eBay too. It's a little book, but it's got a lot of great stuff in it. But I also want to talk a little bit about another topic, which is this topic of ageism. And by the way, that note in this book that ageism is spelled in my preferred way. This chair rocks. That's a nice title for it's a manifesto against ageism. The author is Ashton Applewhite. And it essentially talks about some of the ways in which we can encounter it. The story I told earlier about forgetting the toast is an ageist story. There are ageist sayings. You know, it's hard to be nostalgic when you can't remember anything. I should have really used that as an introduction to the remembering subject, the remembering topic. So, what are examples? Skinner has a couple, by the way, and Skinner and Vaughan have a couple. Um, if you get to be my age, you'll find people saying things like, they'll ask how old you are, and you'll tell them. I'm 87, uh, going on 88. The difference between 87 and 88, by the way, is as long as I'm 87, I'm closer to 85 than I am to 90. When I get to be 88, it'll be the other way around, and that's a downer. But anyway, but you get people who say you look good for your age. Well, that means we expect old people to look wrinkled and shrivel up, and yes, some of them do. And sometimes I run into people who look older than me, who it turns out are younger than me. Well, people vary. But it turns out that over recent years, it's come some of the older folks I know who are involved in some social groups I'm involved with here in Maryland, where we have a group called the Village in Howard, which is a bunch of uh, older folks who want to keep living in their homes and help each other out with things. Um, they talk about it as our bonus years. When I was a kid, the idea that I'd still be active after the age of 65 or so would have been surprising to me. But older folks are doing better than they used to, and you folks probably have more years ahead than you might imagine, and you might as well make good use of them. So when somebody says you look good for your age, one of the responses to that is, this is what my age looks like. Um, it People tend to have lower expectations for older folks, and yes, of course, we're going to run into problems. Another example is if you're accompanied by a younger person. Well, let me start with the wheelchair example. We have one member of that group I just mentioned is a woman uh, who's got mobility problems and occasionally has to be pushed around in a wheelchair. And when a younger person is pushing her around in a wheelchair and she has to see a doctor, the doctor tends not to look at her, but look at the person pushing the wheelchair and doesn't address questions to her and treat her as somebody who can handle the questions, but rather figures the person who's pushing the wheelchair is the one to do that. If you are an older person and you are accompanied for some reason or other by a younger person to a doctor, you may find that the doctor is always talking to the younger person. Now, I go back through a whole series of things. When I was much younger, uh, there were family and ethnic traditions, which meant that if you're an older person and you had a serious disease, the doctor didn't talk to you about it. The doctor talked to the younger family members and got recommendations for them about how to handle it. That is also a kind of ageism. It exists more in some other cultures than it does in American culture today. And there are all kinds of problems with that. There are problems with ethics. Uh, uh, I recall that when I was uh, early on in my career, and I was really busy in the days before computers and computer processing, in the days that we had typically women who were secretaries who would type things up for us. Their titles have changed, but they also often do similar kinds of work. And there was a woman who was working for me at a time when I was department chair and was teaching courses and had grants and was also involved in various kind of journal editorial activities. And I could keep her busy full time. And she was an incredible stenographer. And I'd hand her something which was my sloppy drafts. And she would generate them and was so good at it that she would seldom even have typos. Those were the days when, if you were typing something, you type it with carbon paper. And if you made a mistake, what you had to do is then separate the pages out and correct it on each of the individual pages. It was a problematic business, but she seldom had to even worry about that. But one day I got back from her a letter that she was supposed to have typed, and it was just filled with typos. And I finally figured I just had to find out what was going on. I said, "What's going on here? You don't. This is not what you usually do." And these were also the days when women didn't talk about things like going in for routine exams and having a breast exam and so on. Um, and the day before, she had had an examination, and while she was in the waiting room, another woman left the doctor's office, and the receptionist, as this other woman left, said, "Oh, it's so sad. She's got breast cancer, but the doctor hasn't told her yet." Okay, and so my this woman who was then working for me went in, and she was given a clean bill of health. She was told she was fine. But she'd heard the secretary say the doctor hasn't told her yet. And therefore, she started thinking, well, yeah, maybe the same thing is true of me. And she was so upset by it that she was making all these mistakes and all. And I encouraged her to call the doctor's office and to speak to the doctor and to say what happened. Um, and yes, he assured her that she was fine and she didn't have anything to worry about. And she got back to work. But now think of those contingencies. Doctors used to say things like, well, I can tell when my patient is ready to hear it. The thing about that ethical decision as to whether the patient is ready to get that bad news, and it's the kind of thing you got to worry about more and more as you get older. Sooner or later, you're going to see a doctor who's going to give you bad news. There are different ways to take that. Um, if you want to hear about how Skinner took that, by the way, you can listen to him in an interview on NPR, which I think you can get that easily by doing a search. And I'm pretty sure it's also available through the B.F. Skinner Foundation, when he was told by his doctor that he had leukemia. But anyway, those kinds of things we have to address. But if you're in a culture in which you know that doctors will often tell your relatives but not tell you, then you're going to be left in a situation where you got nobody to talk to because it's uncomfortable to bring it up, and they might even deny it if you ask them. Um, the side effects are all of the people who now will not trust what their doctors tell them. So if you've got ethical concerns, if any of you know about these kinds of things, there is the argument that you've got to uh, recognize that the side effects for all of the other people by not being able to trust what you're told, whether it's medical, whether it's behavioral, whatever the circumstances are, really has far reaching kinds of things. And there's a sort of ageism in there. It's much more likely to be the case as you get older that people withhold things from you. And it's because we worry about that that we ask people to give advance directives and so on. Uh, so the Applewhite book that I mentioned has all sorts of interesting examples of how ageism creeps in surprising ways. You do treat people differently as they get older. Sometimes the treatment is nice if you have a special session to honor somebody who's retiring. Yeah, there are all kinds of great things that can follow from that, but sometimes it's a problem. I might as well throw in one more story of those kinds of things. Some of us also benefit from occasionally getting senior discounts as you get older. And when my wife became eligible for a senior discount, she was out shopping with a younger college friend of hers. And the younger college friend and she were both buying something at a place that gave senior discounts. And what the and to get a senior discount, well, I usually say, "Are you okay with my white hair, or do you want to card me?" Turns out that the person behind the counter carded my wife, but not her younger friend, which meant the younger friend looked old enough to be entitled to the senior discount, but my wife didn't. And her younger friend was quite distressed. If you're ever working behind a counter, if you're going to card everybody, because you don't want to create that kind of a discrepancy. So there are all sorts of ways that age enters into it. There are all kinds of ways in which you can treat people different. And here's one of those other things. I told you I should have put this in before the remembering thing. I think it's good time for another poll question.
Alrighty, everybody, here we go. The title of the recommended book about ageism is
This chair rocks. You look good for your age. I forgot the name of this book. All of the above, because these are all books about ageism.
Alrighty, thank you all for taking some time to answer these. Let's shut it down. Oop, and it looks
Okay,
like, whoops, sorry about that. It looks like 58% say this chair rocks, 13%
okay.
say you look good for your age, 10% say I forgot the name of the book, and 19% say all of the above are books about ageism.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't have even put in those second and third ones as because I did they were statements that I threw in there, but they weren't the names of books. So I probably threw people off by putting them in. People obviously recognized those as things they had seen. So anyway, well, we've covered a lot of ground. There are all kinds of other things we could talk about. After all, Skinner and Vaughan wrote a whole book about it, and so did Applewhite. Um, but I'm going to jump right ahead because I suspect that some of you have comments and questions about it. So rather than continue with a few more prepared remarks, I still need the feedback. It's always nice to hear what you folks have to say about it, but also don't hesitate with hard questions. So this is one more question for you, and then we will proceed from there. Okay.
All right, everybody. Yeah, go ahead and answer a poll question about if you have some questions. And if you do, go ahead and throw them into the questions box with the that chat box with the question mark in the middle of it. So this way we can answer them. Um, but if you want to participate in this poll as well, then please go ahead. It won't count against you if you don't. Alrighty, thanks so
I
much.
might, or, or even make a comment rather than ask a question. That would be okay too.
Alrighty, everybody. So it looks like nobody has several questions. 8% say they have one question. 15% say maybe, and most of everybody says no. which is reflected in the questions box so far. So that's awesome. Go ahead and put your questions if you do have them in the questions box so we can take some time. There is about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Alrighty, I'm not seeing anything generating so far, but I am going to give you some time. So let's, if you didn't purchase your CEUs as of yet, you can go ahead and go do that in the store as well. I'll be looking at your attendance and your poll participation first thing tomorrow. So you'll get your CE certificates by lunchtime tomorrow. Oh, here's a question that popped up. What recommendations do you have for older BCPAs who are interviewing for newer positions?
Oh dear. Oh, yeah, I sort of get that, but gee, make you. I don't want to suggest you want to look younger. You would hope that that the in the those looking for things would recognize that experience matters a lot too. That you have a history. So I guess if your suspicion is that because you're older, you might have a disadvantage rather relative to younger applicants for a position. Uh, to try to make that an explicit thing that they take into account and to talk about the things that you might be able to do and have experiences with that younger folks might not be as sophisticated about because they just haven't had as much opportunity to acquire that history. Um, One would hope that experience doing behavior analysis would count for something, and that the more experience you've had, the more valued your contributions would be if you're looking for a position. That's my best guess. I'm not a I think I'm past the point of doing that, but um, but it's certainly the kind of thing I'd think about if I were in that position.
Alrighty. Are there certain activities that help with memory?
Well, it seems the thing I keep seeing as I read things in different areas. You see things like this coming up in the science pages of the news and also again and again and again. The better you you maintain your health, the better for everything. So don't become sedentary. Stay active. Uh, Walk or swim or do something at least 3 or 4 times a week. All of the evidence, and this is particularly important. I had an accident in the fall in which I couldn't even get out of bed for a couple of weeks. It involved uh, my left leg, and I finally did get moving. But the important thing was to get moving, even though it was painful, and then to start getting the exercise going. Um, so so uh, being sedentary, independently of all kinds of other things, is not a good thing. And things like remembering all sorts of physiological things uh, are helped by exercise. Now, there's such a thing as too much exercise, and I'm not sure I believe the no pain, no gain thing. In fact, there are some kinds of things where if you're recovering from an accident, you've got to work through the pain to get things moving because it's going to be there no matter what. But when that is not an issue, um, now setting up schedules and routines of doing it, if there's any one principle that comes out through the Enjoy Old Age book and other kinds of things, it's Skinner talking about setting up an environment which is the only environment in which you do certain things. So he would have an environment which is the only thing he'd do there is write. And he'd get there in the morning and set things up. And when he got into that environment and got going, that set the occasion. And apparently he worked far more efficiently. I wish I was as efficient as that um, uh, because I tended not to fall into that. But I do find that getting at the computer and making the material the appropriate discriminative stimulus helps. So that would be the The second kind of thing, you'll find that if you're doing certain kinds of works in certain environments, that's also the case in which I think I'm much more likely to come up with name of an author that I was trying to remember or something if I'm actually engaged in the work that involves writing about that kind of stuff. So those are the 2 points then, the exercise and the common environment uh, for uh, and that came under the rubric of the state dependent learning kind of thing. When you're in the circumstances under which you learned the thing or you work with the thing in the past, that's when you're most likely to come up with it again. Okay.
Alrighty. So, where can resources for using ABA with the geriatric population best be found?
Say that. I missed the first couple of words. Could you say the beginning of it again? Where?
Where can resources for using ABA with the geriatric population best be found?
Oh, I am not an expert on that. I'd start with the general stuff like reading the Skinner's book and a few of the other things. I am pretty sure that there are special interest groups. If not in ABBA, then through Division 25 or some of the other divisions in the APA. Um, and probably I'm quite sure there are people who've done ABA with geriatric populations, so I suspect the folks in APBA would have resources based on that. So I I can't give you specifically. My first thing would be to do something like type applied behavior analysis, uh, gerontology in the search window of my browser and see what I come up with. I suspect also if you go into Google Scholar and you type in ABA, gerontology, and a few things like that, it would probably, uh, and maybe type in the word review, you would probably come up with some review articles which have looked into those kinds of things and pulled things together. Um, it would not surprise me if there is a journal or two, given that we now have literally thousands upon thousands of people who are doing behavior analysis in various venues that I suspect there's a good population out there. Unfortunately, I can't keep up with it all, so I can't give you the answer to that one. But I hope those. Uh, and by the way, if you find some useful ones, I would be perfectly happy to get an email from you and telling me something about what you found, so I will have that available should I do something like this again. My email address is Catania, spelled like my last name, at umbc.edu. So, and that holds for everybody. If you want to pursue something here, I can't promise that I'm going to give you a quick turnaround. I do know that I have lost things in my inbox and but if you don't get a prompt answer back from me after a week or so, send me a reminder. And once I get a reminder, then I'll put it in a high priority thing and be sure to respond to you.
Alrighty. I do see people logging off. Just please keep in mind that there are about 7 minutes left of the webinar, and you gotta stay the entire time in order to earn your CEUs. So if you are logging off or you know anybody that has, maybe have them rejoin, because they will not qualify if their time doesn't qualify as well. Your CEUs are time based and participation based. Alrighty. So let's get back to the Q&A. Do you see the field of behavioral health growing with an older population, and where are they getting the referral?
Now that's interesting. They won't get the referrals if the general practitioners don't know about it. I think this is a general problem for our field as a whole. I would like to see more, not only I mean, the whole range of developmental populations is at issue here. We ought to have courses in behavioral pediatrics. We ought to have courses in behavioral gerontology. So one of the first places I'd look for those things in general is look at the curricula and different programs where we do have graduate programs, either embedded in psychology departments, but I'd much rather see it happen in independent programs. And we have them at places like, well, you folks know about them. I mean, North Texas has them, and West Virginia has programs that are in part of a psychology department. North Texas has its own behavior analysis department, and there are certainly many, many others. I guess I shouldn't even try naming them because then I have to worry about the ones I've left out. So it's really heartening to see those kinds of things expanding, but we should look at those curricula. And I think even if people don't plan to specialize in particular areas of that sort, it is important that they be well informed about it because they will often run into cases where they can refer somebody else. How we get that into the kind of awareness of it so that doctors know about it to make referrals to it, that's a different sort of thing. And I suspect that those who are more involved with the practice side will probably have way better answers than I do. Remember, I'm originally an experimental psychologist. I've done a few bits of research that do have applied relevance, but most of my stuff has been basic research. I have worked with kids, I have worked with adults, but by far the bulk of my research has been with rats and pigeons. And yes, I have had gerontological pigeons. Pigeons tend to could live when they're appropriately taken care of for roughly 20 years. And so I've had pigeons that have been about that old, and eventually died of natural causes. Uh, but that doesn't help much with respect to the kinds of things you're asking about. Um, uh, it as we tend to I think this is especially important because we tend so often to be identified with the treatment of kids on or education of kids on the autism spectrum. And it is important for the field as a whole that we begin to be recognized as a discipline that can deal with a whole range of issues at a variety of levels. So even a book like Skinner's Enjoy Old Age is important. Maybe it's time for somebody to write a book like that again, a new one. Um, there's still prejudice with respect to Skinner. Uh, on one listserv that I was just looking at, the folks who were writing messages and contributing to the list were bemoaning that a thing in the New York Times just came out talking about Skinner and his mechanistic conditioning and comparing it with some other kinds of things as if somehow uh, what we were involved in was still nothing but the old Pavlovian kinds of procedures. It is amazing how difficult it is to shake those kinds of things, but as a little bit of encouragement, let me remind you of something. Darwin eventually got around to publishing his theory of evolution. His theory of evolution was not that species change over time. That had been taken for granted, by the way, since the 18th century. Everybody took for granted that evolution happened by the time Darwin was worrying about it. His theory was not that evolution happened, which is, by the way, the next time that somebody from some fringe religious sect comes to your door and wants to convert you, ask them what they know about evolution. And if they tell you they don't believe in it, or they tell you they know something about it because they took a course once, ask them whether evolution happens. And if they deny that it happens, remind them about the evolution of COVID to become less lethal, the evolution of resistance of bacteria to antibiotics. Ask them about things that we know we've actually seen happen within human lifetimes. And then remind them that evolution is not a theory. Evolution is something that happened. Darwin had the theory. Okay, that was a digression. But Darwin eventually came out in 1959 because this other guy named Wallace was also about to write something about selection. And his book came out, and for a while it created a big impression. Uh, Thomas Huxley had a debate with Wilberforce at Cambridge University, And we tend to see that history as the victory of this way of looking at things. But Darwin died around 1890, and after Darwin's death, the only kind of genetics that was around to support his theory of evolution, which was based on which was the theory of natural selection, was Mendelian genetics. And Mendelian genetics doesn't have any mechanism for creating the variability that's necessary if Darwinian selection natural selection is going to work. So there was a period of about 30 years called by some uh, historians of biology called the eclipse of Darwinism, in which people were writing books about the death of Darwinism. Around the 1920s, publications began to appear from geneticists which added mutation theory to Mendelian genetics. And they actually were collecting data on mutations. They were using the fruit fly, Drosophila, to do experiments and show that there was this spontaneous level of mutation in species. That spontaneous level of mutation gave the level of variation that was necessary if natural selection was going to work. And so in the 30s then came the modern synthesis, bringing together genetics and Darwinian natural selection. And now biology was on a roll. And through the rest of the 20th century, it became more and more dominant. And eventually, more things came together. And yes, it had to be modified. We now know about lateral selection of genes. We know about methylation that has some heritability of stuff that's not part of DNA. We know how the DNA mechanism works and all sorts of stuff we know. But at the core of it, selection has to be part of it. It doesn't work without Darwinian selection. We also know that what that selection is based on is that what selection is behavior, because if organisms can't avoid predators, if they can't find food, if they can't locate mates, they're not going to survive. So every part of their anatomy and their physiology is at the service of behavior. So behavior is at the core of all of this stuff. And yet, do we say that Darwinism is victorious? Here in the United States, we still have people who don't believe in it, who build museums of the ark and still think that all the species managed to get on this ark within ridiculously recent times. Um, Darwinism still faces challenges. There are people who talk about intelligent design and so forth. So they're not out of the woods yet. And that's been a long time. We're talking about Darwin's publishing it in 1859. We're now like something like a century and a half, roughly, more or less, from those times, and Darwinism still hasn't gotten there. Well, look what happened with us. Early on, Skinner wrote a book about verbal behavior on top of writing his book on science and human behavior, and it was criticized by a linguist. And what was the basis of the linguist criticism? It was that Skinner could not talk about the novel sentences that a child could utter. Couldn't talk about productivity, that the child could produce a sentence that the child had never produced before, that the child could recognize as grammatical a sentence that the child had never heard before. And this linguist argued that that Skinner couldn't do that. I threw in Chomsky. Yes, you know, of course, who I'm talking about. By the way, the fourth episode of my dialogues with Chomsky should be available on YouTube in about 2 weeks from now. And that will probably wrap up that sequence. And it's a very interesting thing because, in fact, Chomsky is willing to acknowledge there that we're studying something different and that there is a compatibility between the two approaches. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, following that critique by Chomsky, we went through a period of time in which Skinner was criticized for his views on freedom and dignity and is criticized for his views on verbal behavior. And we went through a period which I believe is somewhat analogous to the eclipse of Darwinism. That we're going through a period that was an eclipse of our kind of selectionism, which is selection of behavior by its consequences within the lifetime of the individual organism. But now we have a whole armamentarium of methods for creating novel behavior. We've got adduction, we've got shaping, we've got novel instances of higher order classes. We've got all sorts of ways of talking about where novel behavior comes from, which is what Darwinian natural selection needed when the geneticists came along and showed how mutations provided the variation that was necessary. We've not now got the sources of variation to talk about how a child in the early days of talking can now learn these things and come up with variable sentences and respond in that way. And we can talk about the structure of verbal behavior, and we can talk about it in a way that is compatible with some of the things that linguists want to claim. So I'm seeing this just turning around. I'm seeing us just getting going. Uh, we do have the advantage that now we're getting out there in practical terms, and probably some of the advantages of genetics in the early to mid part of the 20th century benefited from the fact that those kinds of findings began to have effects in medicine to the extent that we can spread our influence in behavioral pediatrics and behavioral gerontology in these other areas. That's going to make a difference to us. Now, I'm looking at that from this perspective, having watched some of this stuff happen when I was an undergraduate. It always seemed, yeah, this stuff makes it sense. It's got to go. It's got to be useful. It's got to go somewhere. And I wish it had happened earlier in my career. I'm now seeing this stuff become more and more important. We should be amazed at how much progress we've made. Compared with Darwin, we're not doing so badly. It's going to take another century. If it takes us another century or two, well, let's hope our culture survives all of that. We've got other political things to worry about. But I think, given all of that, I think we're doing pretty well under the circumstances, and all you folks are helping to contribute to that. So thank you for that.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you everybody so much for attending. We will see you on Thursday, I hope, for Meryl Winston's webinar. But thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll be in touch tomorrow for CEUs. You'll get your general certificate of attendance in just about an hour. All right, email support if you have any questions. Bye, everyone.
Take care, all. Bye bye.